Stop her! Don't let that filthy creature near the altar!" The shriek tore through the cathedral like a blade through silk, silencing 400 guests mid-breath. A woman in a tattered grey cloak stood in the centre aisle, her shoes split at the toes, her face half hidden beneath a hood, her thin hands trembling at her sides. At the altar, in ivory lace and a tiara that caught every candle's flame, the bride had turned the colour of curdled milk. Beside her, the groom, a duke of 7 generations, gripped the gilded rail until his knuckles whitened. He did not speak. He could not speak, because the beggar in the aisle had lifted her chin just enough for him to see her eyes, and what he saw in those eyes was not pity, not pleading, not the desperate hunger he had expected. What he saw was a verdict. And what happened next, within the next hour, beneath the painted saints of that cathedral, would unmake 3 fortunes, expose 2 murders, and leave a kingdom whispering one name until the end of the century. But before any of that, I need a small favour from you. If you have ever, even once, loved a story where the quiet ones are not weak, where dignity is a weapon sharpened slowly in the dark, please take a moment now to subscribe to this channel. Tap the like button and turn on the bell so the next tale finds you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what hour it is where you sit, because I want to know who is here with me tonight. And before we return to that cathedral, ask yourself this question and answer it below. Would you have spoken, or would you have waited? Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Let us begin properly. 6 years before that shriek in the cathedral, the Duchy of Wenslow was the brightest jewel in the northern provinces, a long green expanse of orchards and ironworks and tenant villages tucked between 2 rivers, all of it governed from the pale stone walls of Greymore Hall. The Duke who held it then, Lord Ambrose Wenslow, was a man approaching 40, dark-haired and grave-mouthed, with the kind of voice that did not need to rise to be obeyed. He had inherited the title at 22 upon the sudden death of his father, and in the years since he had doubled the duchy's revenue, drained 2 unprofitable marshlands into farmland, and rebuilt the orphan asylum at Holdfern with his own purse. He was, by every public account, a serious man. What the public did not know was that he was also, in private, a man capable of being utterly disarmed by a single laugh in a library. The laugh belonged to a young woman named Henrietta Velmont, the only daughter of a minor baron whose lands lay 3 counties south. She had come to Greymore with her father for the autumn hunt, and on the second evening of the visit she had wandered into the Duke's library looking for a book of botanical plates, and she had laughed at a marginal note left by his great-grandfather in the corner of an atlas. The Duke had been standing behind a shelf and had heard the laugh before he had seen the woman, and by the time he stepped around the shelf to ask what she had found so amusing, he was, though he did not yet know it, already lost. She had soft brown hair pinned simply, no jewels at her throat, a plain green travelling dress, and she met his eye without flinching. She told him, with perfect calm, that his great-grandfather had drawn a tiny snail in the margin and labelled it the fastest creature in Lombardy. The Duke laughed. He had not laughed aloud in his own library in 9 years. They married 4 months later, in a small ceremony in the chapel at Greymore with only 30 witnesses, because Henrietta had asked for it that way. She did not wish a great spectacle. She did not wish her face on the front of the society pages. She wished only to be his wife, and to be useful to the people of the duchy, and the Duke, who had spent his adult life enduring spectacle, loved her more for asking. For 3 years they were, by every account of those who served them, profoundly happy. Henrietta proved to be more than a quiet bride. She learned the names of every tenant family within a day's ride of the hall. She rebuilt the village school at Hollowmere with funds she would not name, and she sat with sick children in the workhouse infirmary with no glove on her hand. She was not loud. She did not need to be. The servants of Greymore came to love her with a quiet fierceness, and the Duke, watching her at the long table each evening, told his old steward that he had not believed it possible to be so steadily, undramatically content. Then, in the 4th year of the marriage, Henrietta vanished. The official letter, posted to every great house in the province and printed in the city papers, stated that the Duchess of Wenslow had been travelling alone by carriage to visit her ailing father when her party had been attacked by brigands on the high pass above Withersea, and that no survivor had been found. The carriage had been burned. A torn fragment of her travelling cloak had been recovered 3 miles down the gorge, weighted under a stone in the river. The Duke had ridden out himself with 40 men and had searched the pass for 11 days. He had returned, hollow-eyed and silent, and for 1 full year after that, he had not entered the library, where she had laughed at the snail. He wore mourning black for 2 years. He refused every offer of an introduction, every hinted matchmaking dinner, every gentle suggestion from his aunts that the duchy required an heir. He worked. He rode the boundaries. He sat each Sunday in the small chapel where they had married and spoke to no one. And then, in the 5th year after the disappearance, a young woman arrived at Greymore Hall in a carriage of polished black lacquer with the crest of House Crewe upon its door. Her name was Lavinia Crewe, and she was the elder daughter of the Earl of Brackenfell, and she had come, ostensibly, to deliver a letter from her father concerning a shared boundary dispute. She wore a travelling dress of dove-grey silk that fitted her like water poured over marble, and her hair, the colour of new wheat, was pinned beneath a small velvet hat tilted just so. She was 24 years old, possessed of a low, throaty laugh that she had practised in front of mirrors since she was 16, and she had been told by her mother, her father, her aunt, and 3 separate fortune-tellers that she was the most beautiful young woman in the northern provinces. She had come to Greymore with one purpose, and one purpose only, and the boundary dispute was not it. Within an hour of her arrival, the Duke had invited her to stay the night, because the road back to Brackenfell was long and the weather was turning. Within a week she had been invited to stay the month. Within 3 months she was the most talked-about visitor at Greymore in a decade, and the Duke, who had not laughed since the library, had been heard to laugh twice in the long gallery, both times at something Lavinia had murmured behind her fan. Her father, the Earl of Brackenfell, was a man whose estate was, by every honest accounting, 10 years from ruin. He had mortgaged the South Orchards twice, sold off the family silver in a quiet auction in the capital, and dismissed half his household staff under the pretence of renovating the East Wing. The renovations had never begun. The Earl needed, with a desperation he hid behind a hearty laugh and a thick cigar, a son-in-law of immense fortune. The Duchy of Wenslow was that fortune. His wife, the Countess Dorothea Crewe, had drilled their elder daughter for 2 years in the precise art of becoming necessary to a grieving man. Lavinia had been an apt pupil. She had learned to sit quietly in his presence at first, to read the books he read, to ask, with apparent shyness, after the Duchess who had been lost, to weep once, very prettily, when he showed her the chapel. She had learned to wear muted colours in the first month, and brighter ones only as he began, almost without noticing, to expect her presence at dinner. She had learned to befriend the Duke's old aunt, Lady Margaret, and to bring her marzipan from the village, and to listen, with apparent fascination, to the old woman's complaints about gout. By the end of the first year of her residence at Greymore, Lady Margaret was telling everyone within earshot that Lavinia Crewe was the daughter she had never had, and that the Duke would be a fool not to marry her. By the end of the second year, the Duke had begun to think, with a guilt that nauseated him at the breakfast table, that he might one day be able to marry again. He proposed in the third spring, after Lavinia's arrival, in the rose garden Henrietta had planted with her own hands. Lavinia wept, accepted, and that same evening wrote a letter to her mother, containing only 3 words. It is done. The wedding was set for the 1st of October in the great cathedral of the provincial capital, with the bishop himself to officiate, 400 invited guests, and a reception at Greymore afterward that would, according to the menus already being drawn up in the kitchens, include 30 courses, 6 varieties of imported oyster, a roast peacock dressed in its own feathers, and a wedding cake taller than a tall man. Lavinia had personally selected every plate, every flower, every guest, and every musician. She had also, in the months leading up to the wedding, made several quiet changes to the household at Greymore that had not yet come to the Duke's attention. She had dismissed the old housekeeper, Mrs. Ainsworth, who had served the late Duchess for 9 years, on a fabricated charge of pilfering. She had replaced 2 of the head gardeners with men of her own choosing. She had insisted, with apparent sweetness, that the chapel where the Duke had married Henrietta be closed and its key kept by her personally, on the pretence that it was too painful for him to pass. And she had begun, in the late evenings when the Duke was at the ironworks, to walk through the long gallery of Greymore with a thin candle and a thin smile, pausing in front of the portrait of the late Duchess Henrietta, and saying aloud to the empty hall, in a voice of soft contempt, certain phrases that no servant would have dared repeat. But servants hear everything, and one servant in particular, a kitchen girl of 14 named Tilly Marsh, hearing those phrases on 3 separate evenings, had begun to write them down. She did not know what she would do with them. She only knew that her old mistress, the Duchess Henrietta, had once given her a warm cloak when she had arrived at Greymore, shivering from the orphan asylum, and that the new mistress, Lady Lavinia, had slapped her twice already for setting a teacup down too loudly. Tilly Marsh was a small, dark-haired, frightened girl with a startling memory, and she kept her notes folded inside the lining of that warm cloak, the one the Duchess had given her, the one she still wore on cold mornings down to the dairy. She did not know that her notes would, in time, become the hinge upon which a kingdom turned. The cruelty of Lavinia Crewe, in the months leading up to the wedding, was the kind of cruelty that hides itself behind perfect manners in any room that contains the Duke, and reveals itself the instant the door closes behind him. In the Duke's presence she was tender, attentive, soft-voiced. She laid her hand on his sleeve. She asked after his tenants. She suggested, with apparent generosity, that he double the Christmas pension to the retired workers at the ironworks. The Duke, hearing these things, told himself that he was a fortunate man twice over, that grief had not been the end of his life, that the late Duchess would have wanted him to find peace. He did not see the look Lavinia gave the parlour-maid when the parlour-maid was slow to refill the tea. He did not hear the words she used to the laundress when a tablecloth came back insufficiently white. He did not know that she had, in the 3rd week of August, ordered the dismissal of an under-gardener, a man of 62, who had served at Greymore for 41 years, because the man had failed to remove his cap quickly enough when she passed him on the lower path. The under-gardener had wept in the kitchen that evening, and Mrs. Hollis, the cook, who had loved the old Duchess and now feared the new, had given him a half-loaf of bread and a packet of cold ham, and had told him to wait, only to wait, that something was coming, though she could not say what. Mrs. Hollis was not a woman given to mysticism. She did not consult cards or read tea leaves, but on 3 separate occasions in that long summer, she had woken in the small hours of the morning with the unshakable feeling that the late Duchess Henrietta was somewhere very near, and was watching, and was waiting. She had told no one of this feeling, because she was a sensible woman and did not wish to be thought mad. But she had begun, without quite knowing why, to keep a low fire burning in the kitchen all through the night. The Countess Dorothea Crewe arrived at Greymore in the first week of September to oversee the final preparations for the wedding, and within 3 days she had made her presence felt in every wing of the house. She was a tall, sharp-faced woman of 50, with iron-grey hair piled high, and a voice that could cut through a closed door. She walked the halls with a small lacquered notebook in her hand, in which she wrote down, with a thin gold pencil, every object she intended to have moved, sold, replaced, or thrown away once her daughter was Duchess. She did not bother to hide this notebook. She left it open on side tables. She read aloud from it to her daughter in the breakfast room, in tones of brisk satisfaction. The old portraits in the long gallery were to be taken down and stored in the cellars. The chapel where the Duke had married his first wife was to be deconsecrated and converted into a private sitting room for Lavinia. The rose garden was to be ploughed under and replaced with a parterre in the new continental style. The set of pearl-handled silver that had belonged to the late Duchess's mother was to be melted down and recast into a tea service bearing the Crewe crest. The kitchen girl, Tilly Marsh, hearing this last item from her hiding-place behind the dumbwaiter, wrote it down on a scrap of paper that night, her hand shaking so badly that the letters slanted across the page like a flock of startled birds. The Countess had, on her second evening in residence, requested a private audience with the Duke in the small library, in which she had presented him with what she called a humble suggestion concerning the marriage settlement. She had brought with her a sheaf of papers prepared by the Brackenfell solicitor, which proposed that, upon the marriage, a sum equivalent to 1/3 of the duchy's annual revenue be settled upon Lavinia in her own name, and that, in the event of the Duke's death without issue, the entire ironworks at Holdfern be conveyed to Lavinia's eldest brother. The Duke had read the papers in silence, had set them down, and had said, in a voice quieter than usual, that he would have his own solicitor examine them. The Countess had smiled, had laid a hand on his sleeve in unconscious imitation of her daughter, and had said that of course there was no rush. The papers remained on the Duke's desk for 2 weeks. He did not sign them. He did not raise the matter. But Lavinia, that same fortnight, complained of headaches twice at the breakfast table, sighed audibly when the Duke entered a room, and on one occasion, finding him alone in the rose garden, told him with downcast eyes that she sometimes feared he did not truly trust her, that perhaps the wedding should be postponed, that perhaps she had been mistaken about his feelings. The Duke, appalled, took her hands and apologized. Within a week he had signed the papers. The Countess Dorothea, reading the news in a letter from her daughter, laughed aloud in her sitting room at Brackenfell, and poured herself a glass of the Duke's claret. There was, however, another item on the Countess's lacquered notebook list, an item she didn't read aloud, an item that appeared only as a small notation in the margin beside the entry for the chapel. The notation read simply, "Ask L about the woman at Withersea." It was this notation, more than any other, which would, in the fullness of time, destroy her. Because the woman at Withersea was not dead. The woman at Withersea had spent 5 years in a stone cottage at the edge of the high moor, where she had been carried, half frozen and bleeding from a wound to her temple, by a shepherd named Eamon Holroyd, who had found her at dawn beside the wreckage of a burned carriage. The shepherd was a man of 60, with no wife and no children, and he had carried her 3 miles on his back through snow to his cottage, and he had cleaned the wound, and he had not spoken to a living soul about her existence for the entire 5 years that followed, because she had asked him, on the 3rd day of her fever, when she had finally remembered her own name, not to. She had remembered other things in that fever. She had remembered the face of the coachman who had driven her that day, a man not from Greymore, a man with a scar across his lip, a man who had been newly hired by her own father-in-law's distant cousin only the week before. She had remembered him drawing the carriage up at the high pass, claiming a lame horse, and stepping down. She had remembered the second carriage that had been waiting in the trees, and the 4 men who had emerged from it, and the older woman in the dark cloak who had stepped down last, and who had spoken 1 line, and 1 line only, before the blow came. The line had been, "Make certain there is nothing left to identify." The older woman in the dark cloak had been Dorothea Crewe. Henrietta Velmont had not known the name then. She had known only the face. She had carried that face in her mind through 5 years of recovery in a shepherd's cottage on a high moor, while she learned to walk again, while she learned to write again, with a hand that for 2 years had refused to hold a pen, while she planned, with a patience that the shepherd had once said was the patience of stones, what she would do when she was ready. She had not written to her husband. She had wanted to. There had been 1 night in the 2nd winter when she had sat by the shepherd's small fire with a half-finished letter on her knee, and had wept until the shepherd had taken the letter gently from her hand and had burned it. He had told her then, in his slow, careful voice, that whoever had wanted her dead for a reason, and that if she wrote 1 letter, even 1 before she knew the reason, the people who had ordered her killed would simply finish what they had begun, and would, in all likelihood, kill her husband too. She had stared at him a long time over the fire. Then she had nodded once, and she had not written another letter for 3 years. In the meantime, she had begun, with the shepherd's help, to learn. He had a brother in the provincial capital, a clerk in the records office of the High Court, a man named Thomas Holroyd, who could be trusted with a closed mouth and an open ledger. Through this brother, in small, careful queries posted under false names, Henrietta had learned, piece by piece over 3 patient years, that the man with the scar across his lip had been paid 200 guineas in gold by a notary acting for the Earl of Brackenfell 6 days before her carriage had been attacked. She had learned that the same notary had drawn up, only a month after her supposed death, a private memorandum of intent between the Earl of Brackenfell and a distant cousin of the late Duke, in which the cousin had agreed, in exchange for a sum to be paid upon completion, to introduce the Brackenfell family socially to the bereaved Duke. She had learned that the cousin had died, conveniently, of a sudden fit of the heart, 11 months later, before any payment had been made. She had learned that the Countess Dorothea Crewe had, in the year before Henrietta's marriage to the Duke, attempted to introduce her own daughter Lavinia to him at 3 separate balls, and had been politely but firmly rebuffed each time. She had learned, finally, in the 5th spring after the attack, from a letter the shepherd's brother had copied out by hand from the Court Gazette, that the Duke of Wenslow had become engaged to Lavinia Crewe, and that the wedding would take place at the cathedral on the 1st of October. She had read the letter twice. She had folded it. She had walked out of the cottage and across the high moor in the pale spring light, and she had stood for a long time at the edge of the cliff above the gorge where her carriage had burned, and she had not wept. When she had come back to the cottage that evening, she had said to the shepherd, very quietly, "I am going to need a grey cloak and a pair of broken shoes, and you must teach me how to walk like a woman who hasn't eaten in 3 days." The shepherd had looked at her across the fire and had said, in his slow, careful voice, "You will not go alone." She had told him he could not come, that he was too well known on the moors, that his face was the only kindness she had known in 5 years, and she would not risk it. He had nodded. Then he had told her that his brother in the capital had a wife whose sister was the chambermaid of the bishop, who would marry the Duke and Lavinia Crewe, and that this chambermaid owed the shepherd a small debt of an old kindness, and that, if the Duchess wished, a message could be carried. Henrietta had thought a long while. Then she had said, "No message. Only one favour. I wish to know the precise hour the wedding will begin, and I wish to know which door of the cathedral will be left unguarded in the half-hour before." The shepherd had nodded again, and that night he had ridden down the moor on his oldest pony to the post road, and he had not returned for 9 days. When he had returned, he had carried, wrapped in oilcloth inside his shirt, 3 things: a folded paper bearing the time of the wedding and the name of the door, a small leather pouch containing 12 gold coins, which his brother had pressed upon him from the savings of the clerk's lifetime, and a single sheet of cream-coloured paper, sealed with red wax, which his brother had obtained at considerable risk from a friend in the registrar's office, and which bore, in faded brown ink, the original marriage certificate of Henrietta Velmont and Ambrose Wenslow, signed by the bishop himself 9 years before, and bearing the unbroken seal of the Duchy of Wenslow. The certificate had never been annulled. The Duchess had never been declared legally dead. The wedding planned for the 1st of October was, in the strictest reading of the law of the land, a bigamy. Henrietta had taken the certificate in her hands and had stood at the window of the cottage for a long time, watching the light move on the moor. Then she had folded it twice and had sewn it, with her own thin fingers, into the lining of the grey cloak the shepherd had brought her from the village rag market. She had left the cottage 3 days before the wedding, on foot, with a stick of hawthorn and a crust of barley bread, and the 12 gold coins divided between her shoe and her bodice. She had walked the first 20 miles. She had taken the carrier's wagon the next 40, sitting silent among barrels of salt fish and crates of brown eggs, her hood pulled low. She had slept one night in a hayrick, and one night in the porch of a wayside chapel, and on the morning of the wedding she had walked the final 3 miles into the provincial capital with the dust of the road grey on her cheeks and her broken shoes leaving small spots of blood on the cobbles. She had eaten nothing for 2 days. The hunger was not entirely planned, but it gave her, as she approached the cathedral square, exactly the look she needed. The cathedral square that morning was a sea of carriages, plumes, ribboned horses, footmen in livery, flower sellers hawking last bouquets, pickpockets working the edges, and ordinary people of the city pressed 3 deep behind the wooden barriers the city watch had set up to keep the common folk back from the great doors. Henrietta moved through this crowd as a shadow moves through a forest, hood low, eyes down, one hand on her stick and one hand clutching the cloak closed over her thin chest. No one looked at her twice. A constable shoved her aside once with the flat of his hand, telling her to keep back from the gentry, and she went without a word. She made her way, slowly, with the patience of stones, around the long flank of the cathedral, to the small north door that the bishop's chambermaid had named in the folded paper. The door stood ajar. A young verger in a white surplice glanced at her once, took her for an old beggar woman come for the customary alms loaf distributed to the poor on noble wedding days, and waved her in with an irritated flick of his hand toward the side aisle, where 3 other beggars already sat on a low bench, waiting. She sat with them. She bowed her head. She listened to the great organ begin its prelude, and to the rustle of 400 silk gowns settling into the pews, and to the bishop's voice intoning the opening prayer in Latin, and to the slow grand procession of the bride down the long central aisle on the arm of her father, the Earl of Brackenfell. She listened, beneath her hood, to the Duke's voice from the altar, steady and grave, answering the bishop's first question. She waited. She waited until the bishop had reached the precise line in the rite, at which he would ask whether any person present knew of any lawful impediment why these 2 should not be joined. The bishop drew breath. The cathedral held its silence. And Henrietta Velmont rose from the beggar's bench, walked out from the side aisle into the great central nave, lifted her face just enough that the candlelight caught it, and said in a voice that did not shake, "I do." The shriek had come from the Countess Dorothea Crewe, who had been seated in the front pew, and who had turned at the sound of the footstep, and had seen, across the length of the marble floor, the face she had last seen 5 years before on a snowy pass above Withersea. The shriek had been the cry of a woman seeing a ghost. "Stop her!" the Countess had screamed. "Stop her! Do not let that filthy creature near the altar." 2 ushers had started forward. They had stopped almost at once, because the beggar woman in the aisle had not run. She had not flinched. She had simply walked, slowly, on her broken shoes, leaving small dark spots on the marble, straight up the center of the cathedral toward the altar, and as she walked, she had lowered her hood the rest of the way, and 400 people had seen, in the slow horror of recognition, a face that many of them had once known. An old marchioness in the 3rd pew had risen halfway from her seat with her hand at her throat. A retired general in the 5th pew had said aloud, "Dear God in heaven." A young woman who had been a bridesmaid at the Duke's first wedding had begun to weep without sound. The Duke himself, at the altar, had taken 1 step forward, then a second, and then he had stopped because his legs would no longer carry him. His face had gone the color of paper. His mouth had opened, and had closed, and had opened again. "Henrietta," he had said, in a voice that was not a voice, but the broken edge of one. She did not look at Lavinia. She did not look at the Countess. She looked only at her husband, and she walked the full length of that aisle with her eyes on his, and when she reached the altar, she stopped 6 paces from him, and she said, quietly enough that only the nearest pews could hear, "I am alive, my lord." The bishop, who had been standing with his prayer book half raised, set the book down on the altar with the careful slowness of a man whose hands have begun to shake. Lavinia Crewe, in her ivory lace and her grandmother's tiara, had not moved. Her face had gone first white, then a strange greyish-green. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. The Countess in the front pew had sat down abruptly, her hand still at her mouth. The Earl beside her had begun, very quietly, to swear. Henrietta turned her face, for the first time, toward the front pew, and she looked at the Countess across the marble floor, and she said, in the same quiet voice, "Hello, mother of the bride. We have, I believe, met once before, on a high pass above Withersea, on a winter morning, 5 years ago." The Countess made a sound that was not a word. Henrietta turned back to the bishop. She reached into the lining of her grey cloak. She drew out the cream-coloured paper sealed with red wax, and she held it up so the candlelight could catch the seal, and she said, "Your Grace, I am Henrietta Velmont Wenslow, lawful wife of the Duke of Wenslow, married in this same cathedral 9 years ago by your own hand, and never lawfully parted from him by death or decree. This is the certificate of that marriage, bearing your seal and his. I submit it as the impediment you have asked the assembly to declare." The bishop took the paper. He broke the seal with a thumb that trembled. He read it once. He read it a second time. He looked up at Henrietta, and then at the Duke, and then at Lavinia Crewe, and he said, in the voice of a man who has just understood that the next words he speaks will be quoted in chronicles for 200 years, "This marriage cannot proceed." The cathedral did not erupt. The cathedral went, instead, utterly silent, the silence of 400 people who have all simultaneously stopped breathing. Into that silence came one sound, the sound of Lavinia Crewe's tiara striking the marble step as she fainted forward into the arms of the startled groomsman behind her. The Duke had not moved. He was staring at his wife as a man stares at the sun after long blindness, and tears were running down his face into his collar, and he did not seem to know it. Henrietta turned to him then, and her own composure cracked, just for an instant, the corner of her mouth pulled down, her eyes wet, and she said softly, "I am sorry, my lord, that I could not come sooner. There were reasons." She turned back to the cathedral. She lifted her voice, not loud, but clear enough that it carried to the furthest pillar. She said, "The reasons sit in the front pew." From the back of the cathedral, from the great west doors, which had until that moment remained closed, there came the sound of those doors being opened from outside, slowly and deliberately, and the sound of boots on marble, many boots moving in formation. Heads turned. Down the long centre aisle came 8 men in the dark green and silver of the Duchy's own guard, with the steward of Greymore Hall at their head, a tall, white-haired man named Hollis Garrick, who had served the late Duke and the present Duke for 41 years, and who carried, on a small silver tray, 3 sealed documents and a small leather-bound book. Behind the steward came 2 officers of the High Court of the province in their black robes and white bands. Behind the officers came a small, thin, dark-haired girl in a clean grey dress and a warm cloak too large for her shoulders, walking between them with her chin high and her eyes very wide. Tilly Marsh had not, until that morning, ever been inside a building larger than the dairy at Greymore. Behind Tilly Marsh came a man of 60, with the leathered face of someone who has spent his life in weather. In his Sunday coat, his cap clutched in both hands. Eamon Holroyd had not entered the city in 20 years, and behind the shepherd came a thin, stooped clerk in a brown coat carrying a heavy ledger bound with brass corners. Thomas Holroyd of the Records Office had brought with him every document his patient pen had copied in 3 years. The procession halted at the foot of the altar. The steward, Hollis Garrick, stepped forward, bowed once, very deeply to Henrietta, and said, in a voice that broke only at the last word, "Your Grace. Welcome home." Several servants among the wedding party, who had until this moment been standing rigid against the side walls in their formal livery, dropped to their knees on the marble. One of the older maids began openly to weep. The Duke, hearing his old steward say those 2 words, made a sound that no one in that cathedral would ever forget, a low, broken sound, such as a man makes when grief and joy strike him at the same instant, and he cannot tell which is killing him. He took 2 steps forward and went down on one knee in front of his wife, and he took her thin, worn hand in both of his and pressed it to his forehead, and he wept without sound. Henrietta laid her free hand on his hair, very lightly. She said, "Get up, my lord. There is still work to do today." He rose. He looked for the first time at Lavinia Crewe, who was being held upright by 2 bridesmaids, her face the colour of ash, her eyes blank. He looked at the Countess in the front pew. He looked at the Earl beside her, and the grave-mouthed man whom the Duchy had called serious for 20 years became, in that moment, something colder and harder than serious. He turned to the officers of the High Court at the foot of the altar, and he said, "Your Honours, in the presence of this assembly and of the bishop, I formally request that you take into custody the Countess Dorothea Crewe and the Earl of Brackenfell on the charges of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to defraud a peer of the realm, and attempted bigamy." The senior officer bowed. He turned. He gestured to the green and silver guards, and 4 of them moved at once down the aisle toward the front pew. The Earl rose, blustering, his face purple. He shouted that this was an outrage, that he was a peer, that no one would lay hands upon him, that the woman in the aisle was an impostor and a vagrant, and would be revealed as such within the hour. The senior court officer turned to him calmly and said, "My lord, the woman in the aisle is identified by the steward of her own household, by the bishop who married her, by her own husband, and by the marriage certificate now in the bishop's hand. You may speak further at your arraignment." The guards laid hands upon him. He went on shouting. The Countess did not shout. The Countess sat very still in the front pew, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes on Henrietta, and her mouth had become a thin, straight line. She did not resist when the guards lifted her by the elbows. As they led her past Henrietta in the aisle, she paused, and she said, in a low voice, meant for the Duchess alone, "You should have stayed dead, you stupid girl." Henrietta looked at her without expression. She said, "Some debts grow larger when left unpaid, madam. Yours has grown for 5 years." The Countess was led away. Lavinia, half conscious, was lowered into a pew. The senior court officer turned to the bishop and asked, with the precise courtesy of his office, whether the bishop wished the cathedral cleared. The bishop, his face still ashen, looked at the duke, and the duke looked at his wife, and Henrietta said, "No, your grace. Let them stay. What follows ought to be witnessed." The steward Hollis Garrick stepped forward then, and laid the small silver tray upon the altar, and the senior court officer took up the first of the 3 sealed documents and broke it open. It was a sworn statement from the man with the scar across his lip, who, 3 weeks earlier, had been arrested in the port city of Marenford on an unrelated charge of theft, and who, when shown the records office clerk's quiet evidence of his connection to the burned carriage on the pass above Withersea, had wept and confessed, and named his employer in writing. The employer named was Dorothea Crewe. The second document was the notary's memorandum, in the notary's own hand, of the payment of 200 guineas in gold 6 days before the attack. The third document was a copy, certified by the clerk Thomas Holroyd, from the original held in the High Court's archive, of a private letter the Countess had written to her sister 3 years before Henrietta's marriage to the Duke, in which the Countess had set out, in plain and unembarrassed prose, her intention to one day see her daughter installed as Duchess of Wenslow, by whatever means proved necessary. The court officer read each document aloud in the slow, flat voice of his office, and the cathedral listened in a silence that had become, by the end of the third document, the silence of a courtroom rather than a church.